Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Tony Blair has told Sky News that it's possible that Brexit won't happen and believes it is absolutely necessary that it shouldn't go ahead. The former Prime Minister says he thinks EU leaders would be prepared to give ground on key issues to keep Britain in the EU. And he told Sophie Ridge that he believes public opinion is changing now that the difficulties of Brexit negotiations are clear.
I think it's possible now that Brexit doesn't happen. I think it's absolutely necessary that it doesn't happen, because I think every day is bringing us fresh evidence that it's doing us damage economically, certainly doing us damage politically. I think public opinion is moving on it. Look, this time last year we were the fastest growing economy in the G7, we're now the slowest. Our savings ratio is at the lowest for 50 years. The investment community internationally has now gone really negative on us. Our currency's down 10, 12%. Investment in the motor car industry, for example, is down 30%. Living standards are stagnating. I mean, this is causing us real damage. That's beyond doubt.
Well, let's talk to Lindsay German, left-wing writer and political activist, founding member and convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Lindsay, many thanks for joining us once again on Sky News. Is there a grain of truth to what Tony Blair is saying here? Is it entirely possible that Brexit, excuse me, that Brexit might not happen?
Well, I think there's plenty of people who want Brexit not to happen, including Tony Blair, who's been banging this same drum for a long, long time now. But I think that actually it would be a big mistake to go along the road that he's talking about, and to say that there has to be either a second referendum or some kind of second guessing of what people really voted for. I think there has to be a starting point that people voted to leave the EU. That has to be respected. I think the real question is, what kind of society do we want? And the problem is that Tony Blair doesn't have any answers to this at all. In fact, I think you can see the Leave vote as a reaction against politicians, including himself, who really led to a lot of disillusion, particularly among traditional Labour voters. And it's only Jeremy Corbyn who's beginning to get some of those back now.
But what is then Jeremy Corbyn's approach to this Brexit debate in terms of, you know, single membership of the single market, in terms of the freedom of movement that is so coveted by the European Union? There doesn't appear to be much coming from the Labour Party on Brexit at the moment that would appeal to those, as you describe them, traditional Labour voters.
Well, I don't think that's true. I think what Jeremy Corbyn is saying is that there has to be a respect for the vote, but there has to be a Brexit which doesn't harm working people's living standards, which doesn't make it more difficult for people, which doesn't mean that they have to accept worse rights for workers at work, for example, which is one of the things that's been talking about.
The foundation of Tony Blair's entire point is that Brexit itself would be bad for working people.
But if you listen to what he says, this is totally fallacious, because he says, for example, inequality is getting worse, living standards are falling. This is all true. It doesn't date from last June. It dates from a whole number of policies, both internationally and in terms of governments in recent years, which have led to this growth of inequality, particularly since 2008. Now, if you look at what happened in the election, Jeremy Corbyn didn't win, but he won far more votes than people expected, a far higher proportion of the vote, and he did so on the basis of saying we have to change this, we have to end inequality, we have to look at public ownership again, we have to do all those sorts of things. And we face huge problems in this country to do with social care of old people, to do with housing, to do with the levels of debt that young people are now facing. This talk from Tony Blair doesn't deal with a single one of these questions. It deals only with this kind of idée fixe that he has, that we have to abandon Brexit. And to be honest, I don't really see that he has very, very much to offer in this particular debate. I think people have had enough of hearing him over recent years and really want to look at what sort of society do we want Britain to be.
You mentioned the election result there, which took plenty of people by surprise, including, I imagine, some within the Labour Party. Tony Blair praising Jeremy Corbyn. It's quite something. As someone who knows Mr Corbyn well, I wonder what you think he makes of this endorsement by the former Prime Minister.
I should think Jeremy takes a view with Tony Blair and with a number of people that he's very grateful for any endorsement, but that he never expected or got it in the past, and I don't suppose it'll be there for very much longer in the future.
Jeremy Corbyn, of course, out on the campaign trail again today, describing the Tories, as he has done in the past, as a zombie government. It all really has the feel from the Labour side at the moment that they are desperate for another election to be held and as soon as possible. That seems a remote prospect. Do you think an election sooner rather than later would be a good thing, or is it just the type of chaos that we don't need at this stage in the Brexit process?
Look, we have a government that can't do anything. I mean, if we're going to talk about chaos, we have a government which can't put laws through, which has, there's been very few votes in Parliament since it reconvened after the election, which has massive difficulty getting any domestic or any international agenda through, which doesn't have a widespread consensus. So we have chaos already, and this isn't a question of what Labour wants. What is it that people in this country want? And everybody says, oh, nobody wants another election. That is not my experience. I think lots of people feel that if there were an election in the near future, that Jeremy Corbyn would do very well and might well win this election. And I think people are very, very disillusioned with this Tory government already. Theresa May has very, very low standing now. The way in which the government has handled all sorts of issues, including Grenfell and some of the things that we've seen since the election, I think people would welcome the chance to have a different sort of politics. And that's something that Tony Blair doesn't really have anything to say about.
Lindsay German, always good to talk to you. Many thanks for joining us on Sky News. Well, to discuss this, we're joined from Westminster by the former UKIP leader, Nigel Farage. Mr Farage, many thanks for being with us. I wonder, as someone who, like Mr Blair, has stepped back from frontline politics but still manages to get their voice heard, what you make of Tony Blair's intervention?
I think it's a pretty loathsome performance, frankly. I mean, he's showing people why he is now one of the most disliked living figures in British politics. He wants to reverse the result of a democratic referendum. He's making it clear that anything must be done to stop us leaving the EU. He suggests that public opinion has shifted. Well, actually, there are more people in favour of Brexit now than there were at the time of the referendum. But the real irony here is, of all the people to argue that we could get a reform deal with the European Union, Tony Blair is probably the worst placed person to do so, because he, as Prime Minister, was President of the EU for 6 months back in 2005. He promised reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. He got none, and yet gave away £7 billion of our rebate. So I don't think he's a trusted figure on this, or frankly, anything else.
Loathsome he may or may not be, but his point is slightly more nuanced than is just described by yourself. His contention is that various EU leaders that he will have spoken to are willing to make key concessions of the sort that you and others were demanding when in the European Parliament, particularly on freedom of movement, to keep the United Kingdom within the European Union. Now, if that is the case, then why shouldn't that case be allowed to be put to the British public?
Mr Blair, before, when he was Prime Minister, promised us substantial reforms of the terms of our membership. He promised big reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy. He totally failed to deliver. I don't think anybody today is going to take seriously the idea that the EU is somehow going to change its rules. And anyway, the referendum wasn't just about a rule here or there. It was about the supremacy of law. Who governs Britain is what the referendum was about. And Mr Blair, perhaps you weren't listening, but our answer was, we wish to govern ourselves.
Well, with respect, Mr Farage, I mean, some would suggest that Tony Blair might be rather better placed to know the minds of leaders like Macron and Angela Merkel than someone like yourself, who essentially spent many, many years taking, well, the mickey out of them to their faces.
Well, I've spent nearly 20 years there, actually working with them, living with them. I think I know the mindset of the European Union as well as anybody. He argued, Blair, that with the election of Macron, reform is now on the agenda. Well, it is. But the point is, reform in Brussels means more centralisation of powers, not less. So the EU is going in completely the wrong direction. It is in the midst now of its biggest ever argument over the migration crisis, and I think we've left at exactly the right time.
Still, this intervention by Tony Blair does rather suggest that the dynamics of the argument between those who voted Remain and those who voted to leave has somewhat shifted. It does certainly feel right now that those who advocate the case for leaving the European Union are on the back foot, that they are the ones who are being forced to provide answers to the difficult questions.
There is a major problem for Brexit right at the moment, and it's this. All of those on the corporate pro-EU side, the big organisations, the big companies, the very same people who were arguing we should join the euro, we should vote to remain, who are now saying we should stay part of the customs union and single market. They're an organised, effective lobby, and they're putting out their stuff every single day. On the other side of the argument, at the moment, there is no coherent business organisation of all the different groups and companies who see positive benefits from Brexit. And that is the missing piece of a jigsaw in British politics at the moment. And that is something those of us who want Brexit have got to sort out.
Some might suggest that you would be ideally placed to lead such a charge.
Well, we'll have to see, won't we? I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to see through my job in the European Parliament, and report on what I see going on there. But if I can help in any way at all to bring together business voices to counter this daily negative dart that we've got, then I will do so.
Well, what would be your response if you were given that job to the point made by the Prime Minister in the clip that we just played, that the savings ratio, the lowest in 50 years, the investment community internationally negative about the United Kingdom, currency down 12%, investment in the car industry down 30%. It's a pretty stark picture that he paints. How would you defend it?
Well, actually, inward investment throughout the year of 2016 into the UK was very, very good. And the most important thing that I think we should be emphasising is the fact that America, Australia, Japan, 24 countries are lining up, chomping at the bit, saying, right, let's get a proper special trade relationship going between us. And, of course, the positive argument of Brexit was that in terms of trade, in terms of business, we've got the chance now to engage with 85% of the world's economy that is not in the European Union. And these are the positive arguments that now need to be made.
Still, are you as confident as you undoubtedly would have been the morning of the 24th of June 2016 that the United Kingdom will be exiting the European Union?
We'll leave the European Union. Of that, I've got no doubt at all. I think that any party leader that goes against that would be frankly committing electoral suicide. Our minds are made up. So yes, we will leave at the end of March 2019. However, my concern now is that the deal will get so watered down that we'll have left in name only.
Nigel Farage, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's return now to our top story. Tony Blair saying that he believes it's absolutely necessary that Brexit should not go ahead. The former Prime Minister says he thinks that EU leaders would be prepared to give ground on key issues in order to keep Britain in the Union. Well, to discuss this, we're joined from North London by the Liberal Democrat leadership candidate Sir Vince Cable. Many thanks for being with us. I suppose given your party's position on the EU referendum, our departure from the European Union, you welcome this intervention from the former PM.
Well, Tony Blair on this issue is talking a lot of sense and based on a lot of experience. I mean, the part of the problem is that people don't listen to him because of the history of the Iraq War, but actually what he says about Europe is absolutely spot on. He's making a very simple point here that the worries that people have had about migration could be dealt with within the European Union without leaving it. He says he's got assurances from other heads of state, but even if you don't have that, there is plenty of flexibility within the single market. You can subscribe to the principle of free movement. It's a good principle, but there are countries applying it with varying degrees of zeal. So, and at the moment, of course, we have a position where net immigration from Europe is falling rapidly because a lot of Europeans are leaving the UK, the economy is slowing down, few people are brought in. So what was the big issue around the referendum is ceasing to be as big as it was.
Well, it's Mr Blair's contention that the public opinion as regards Brexit is changing as it becomes clear just how difficult it is. I mean, as a number of people have pointed out on social media, people are shooting the messenger rather than the message when it comes to his intervention. At the same time, we all know what the Liberal Democrat position is when it comes to Brexit. You don't want it to happen. And frankly, you're not seeing significant rises in your polling numbers at the moment. Why is that?
Well, I certainly don't want to shoot the messenger. We've got to listen to new evidence wherever it comes from. I think Tony Blair's point, which is right, is that the facts are changing quite rapidly. The economy is already beginning to suffer, and we're seeing it in a whole variety of ways. The loss of investment, the slowdown in consumer spending, the build-up of personal debt as the economy was being kept going. All of those things are clear. We're beginning to see, in a way we didn't do at the referendum, the sheer massive complexity of the negotiation and the parliamentary legislation that may make this very difficult, if not impossible. I think that as time passes, my party's position, which has been very clear from the outset, will be understood and respected, and we will have an absolutely central part in this key stage of British history.
Still, as our chief political correspondent John Craig pointed out just a few minutes ago, I mean, it all comes down to parliamentary arithmetic. As long as Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party continue to take the position that they do, you know, Brexit will happen. Theresa May will get the votes through the House of Commons. Some might suggest that actually it's the Labour leadership you should be targeting with your argument and your rationale rather than the general public.
I think you're making a perfectly valid point that what we have at the moment is a kind of grand coalition between the Conservatives and Labour Party. Of course, they don't present it like that, but Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn are on the same page. They're basically committed to the same objective, which is this hard, extreme form of Brexit. But I think in the case of the Labour Party, this is a very unstable position because many of their supporters, particularly the young people who got behind them in the general election, that's not what they voted for. A lot of their backbenchers are deeply, deeply unhappy about the way their party's going. The Conservatives are also split. So this idea that there is some absolutely solid majority for proceeding along this disastrous path, I think is very shaky indeed. And of course, don't forget the House of Lords. Their makeup is rather different. Very big Liberal Democrat representation in the House of Lords. The government will find it very difficult to bully them when it comes to legislation.
It's still the point that Tony Blair makes that leaders around the European Union stand ready to make concessions in order to keep us within the EU. It does seem rather after the fact. You know, David Cameron did pursue some significant concessions from him, didn't get everything that he wanted. The British public were pretty dissatisfied. I mean, this was a conversation that the EU needed to have with the UK prior to June 23rd, 2016.
I think that's a fair point, and I think there are reasonable grounds for criticism, both of what David Cameron did and of the response of the European heads of government to him when he went to them and tried to renegotiate. I think that's a perfectly fair point. However, the point I would make is that you don't have to get the agreement of 28 heads of government to change the rules around the single market and free movement. They're very good principles. We subscribe to them, or used to, and we should subscribe to them. But within it, there is an enormous amount of flexibility. I spent 5 years negotiating with the Germans to lift restrictions on freedom of movement in relation to professional people. They didn't give an inch. And many other countries pursue, for example, very nationally based systems of procurement, providing they stay within the framework of law. They continue along this path. And I think the problem in the past is that the British have been far too ideological about this and not understanding that within the European Union there's an enormous amount of flexibility. And of course the European Union is changing. We're getting an inner core of the Eurozone and a more loosely connected outer core. We should be adjusting our position to reflect that emerging reality.
Sir Vince Cable, many thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
To discuss this, we're joined from Westminster by The Guardian columnist Don Foster. Don, good to see you again. I wonder if we might start by attempting something of a first and getting you to agree with Nigel Farage. He does have a point, doesn't he, that of all the people to argue that we could get a reform deal, Tony Blair, such a divisive political figure, you know, people are shooting the messenger today and not the message.
No, I never thought that the words "I agree with Nigel Farage" would come out of my mouth, but I actually do. I think, you know, I think we have to accept that the referendum, you know, was carried out. The majority of people did want Brexit to go ahead, and Tony Blair is simply wrong about public opinion. If you look at YouGov surveys, recent ones done by Survation, public opinion hasn't shifted at all. I think we heard a lot of discussion, you know, initially where people claimed that there were lots of, you know, regretful Brexiteers, etc. But when you actually look at it, that hasn't happened. Some people who voted Remain are in favour now. But equally, if you look at Remain voters, you know, including myself, most of them accept the referendum and, you know, and don't want to see it stop, because what happens then is that you have a huge number of people in the country who feel as if they have been ignored, that the Westminster elites have ignored them and gone against their wishes. And I think that's a very, very dangerous thing to do for, you know, for any political party, but equally for the kind of state of the country.
Still, I'm certainly not about to suggest that those who are advancing the cause of Brexit are floundering at the moment, but one certainly does get the impression that they're under a degree of pressure that they possibly haven't been since the vote itself, particularly coming from the business community who want answers to questions that, frankly, the government is not yet in a position to provide.
No, completely. I think the Conservatives completely underestimated how complex Brexit would be. I think they also assumed that they had the upper hand in negotiations. But when you actually come down to it, basically Britain are going to the EU saying we want X, Y and Z. They've got a shopping list. And obviously the EU will turn around and say you have absolutely nothing to offer us. And it doesn't make any sense for the EU to let Britain leave with a good deal, let Britain leave but keep all the kind of positive trappings of the EU. So I think that, you know, I think the negotiation team are coming up against the wall, finding that it's going to be a lot worse than they expect. And that's why the CBI have come out and said that they think it might be impossible. I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next few years and whether or not we can actually manage to get out of the EU in the way we think we can.
I mean, certainly the expectation is that the EU will give us as bumpy a ride as possible as we depart the European Union. But does perhaps Mr Blair have a point when he says that in order to maintain the integrity of the EU project, that they would be willing to make concessions along the lines that people such as Nigel Farage would be very pleased about, for example, an end to freedom of movement?
I think if we get towards the end of negotiations and it becomes almost impossible to see a way out, which could easily happen, I think that at that point maybe the EU would discuss with Britain whether there needs to be a second vote on different terms. You know, if it looks like the kind of Brexit that people voted for is impossible, it may make sense for the EU and Britain to decide that a different vote needs to come forward, or that perhaps an offer is put on the table and the country comes to vote for it. But I think that won't happen for at least a few years until all the options are explored and negotiations are fully fleshed out.
And what's your assessment then of the position being taken by Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party? That, you know, for the time being at least, they are with the government, they are providing the parliamentary support that is needed for votes to take place and go in Theresa May's favour in the House of Commons?
I think it's very smart. I think if you look at Labour voters, around about 35–40% of them voted to leave the EU. Most Remain voters, you know, are unhappy about Brexit but think it has to go forward. So I think that Corbyn and Labour focusing on individual rights and focusing on making sure that people have a good deal out of Brexit is much smarter than Theresa May's kind of hard Brexit or bust sort of sort of approach. I think that in many respects it looks as though Jeremy Corbyn and Labour are seeking seeking a divorce where you look after the children and make sure it's amicable, whereas Theresa May and the Tories are happy to burn their bridges and kind of get rid of the pets.
Don Foster, Guardian columnist and secret Faragista, many thanks for joining us in Sky News. Appreciate it.